Ghost of Tsushima, Sucker Punch Productions' revered samurai game. This third-person action-adventure open-world game is truly a treat if you're yet to play it, and with it approaching 5 years old, and its sequel looming, I thought it was high time I revisited it. In fact, I recorded this gameplay months ago, and then procrastinated for a bit, but now the time has finally come to buckle up and dive in. I'll open by saying this: Ghost of Tsushima's formula reminds me an awful lot of Ubisoft games, specifically the Assassin's Creed series, at least the latter games in the series, and this works both in its favour and against it at times, but I have to say it's that similar format that drew me to this game, with that series now headed for a feudal Japan setting of its own. If anything, that renders Sucker Punch's approach to this setting all the more interesting to look into. Ghost of Tsushima was a brilliant game, but far from a perfect one. Many Ubisoft-isms are just Ubisoft-isms, and no matter who's publishing the game, they stick out like a sore thumb. However, other aspects show Sucker Punch's own identity, the care they have for the title, and how the vaguely identified Ubisoft open-world approach could work for the company for which it has garnered an unofficial nickname identifying it with, if only they cared enough as a cohesive unit. But alas, Ghost is more than just a lesson for another studio and another publisher. It's its own thing. A great game, one I have loved revisiting. In today's video, we're going to explore its pros and its cons, see what needs to improve in the sequel, even if such wishful thinking has well past its best before date, so please, join me as we revisit Ghost of Tsushima. Now, to begin with, I don't want to get too caught up on the story, as it eats so much runtime of the videos that I end up talking about story in, and it ends up mostly being bloated by rehashing the events of the game, and that frustrates me making these videos as much as anybody else watching, so I'm not going to lure you in with the illusion of a narrative analysis. Nonetheless, I must elaborate on the narrative premise of the game, as that is the justification for why we're doing what we're doing. We play as a samurai named Jin Sakai during the time of the Mongol invasions of Japan. At the beginning of the game, we see Tsushima's samurai population absolutely decimated. Jin is the only one to make it out of Komoda Beach alive and free, against the odds considering he was thrown off a bloody bridge, and thus he finds himself alone against the Mongol army and torn between two paths. The honourable world he was raised to occupy, which would result in casualties but retain his lawfulness according to the custom he was taught to live by, and a more dishonourable yet pragmatic approach that his uncle and own programming would not approve of. He's torn between two realities, being a samurai and upholding the status quo even through dark times, and becoming the Ghost, a vengeful protector of Tsushima, doing what must be done to truly be effective. This journey takes him across the island, a beautiful, rich, stunning open world divided into 3 regions, as Jin's very sense of identity, his worldviews, are challenged as he makes new allies and comes to understand multiple perspectives of the world around them, putting him in conflict with his uncle's particularly zealous view of what it means to be a samurai. And while I can't make an argument in either direction as to the historical accuracy of the depiction of samurai in this game, as I'm no expert, this does establish a simple but solid premise for the game to build upon. It gives us a straightforward theme to explore in Jin finally deciding what path to take for himself without overbearing peers, and how casting off his artificial limitations allows him to spend vast portions of the game standing alone against an overwhelming enemy force that exploits those very self-imposed limitations, and externalizes Jin's internal struggle when those limitations attempt to creep back in. As Jin's journey continues, he gets stronger, both physically as he fends off the Mongols, and mentally as he becomes comfortable thinking for himself, challenging the ways he held sacred and prioritising what truly matters, protecting his people. It's a fascinating story at the centre of which we inhabit a stoic character, which if anything makes these development breakthroughs quite substantial, with key moments typically involving a colourful cast of side characters, from menacing adversaries to fallen heroes, unlikely allies and old friends, all of whom have their own narrative beats in wake of the Mongol invasion, and so those progressions are enriched when they intersect. It's by no means groundbreaking, nor is it executed perfectly, but it does adequately, no, eloquently convey that there's much more to this game than simply the awesome satisfying sensation of mutilating people with a sword, even if its main off-the-shelf draw remains said mutilations. Ghost of Tsushima's main storytelling is not the longest I've ever experienced in a game, and thank God, but unlike some of the longest main storylines I've ever suffered in games, it both manages its time well and makes an impact. I'll round up this get the story out the way with vague statements segment by saying this. Most of my critical thought that might relate to the story actually pertains to how the gameplay interacts with it, and you'll certainly be hearing some thoughts on that shortly. But the entire story hinges on a well-explored, well-written moral dilemma that doesn't necessarily break ground among its many gaming peers, but it does provide a followable message and is therefore quite enjoyable. It's well cast, well characterised, has a stunning backdrop to match, and it justifies some really fun gameplay. Through a lack of exposure, I'm unqualified to discuss how it compares to samurai cinema, as I'm led to believe it's inspired by. But regardless of what inspirations it took and what else is out there on the market, Ghost of Tsushima absolutely holds its own, and story is only one slice of the pie. Linear storytelling is but a facet of what makes a single-player game these days, and the rest of the game is there to aid that story just as much as that story is there to justify the game. So with that said, allow me to move on to talking about Ghost of Tsushima's most prominent character, the island of Tsushima, the open world space itself. It's a bit of a cliche to use the phrase the open world is a character in its own right as a praise, and I've slowly come to terms with the belief that the open world is a character regardless of whether it's fantastic or utter dog shit. This is the area within which everything takes place, and you're exposed to it whether it's interesting or dull. Just like any prominent character in the story, like it or not, we have to get to know it. And my god, is this game's world space absolutely glorious. What it boasts most prominently is an array of visual differences that allow you to identify where you are with minimal HUD interference, and that both allows you to get lost in the world without having to consult an ugly compass at the top of the screen, and also provides you reassurance through the environmental changes that without too much clutter going on the screen, you will eventually learn your way around. This doesn't mean you have to completely navigate by yourself. You can use a guiding wind to lead you to a map marker or indeed an objective, which I suppose from a bird's eye view is a bit of a sin on the front of the wind is always moving in the direction that you happen to need to go, but it's so abstract that you can easily suspend your disbelief on that, and the game doesn't shy away from providing you with plenty of beautiful scenery, so there's a limited cause to fixate on how Ghost of Tsushima disguises its gameisms. The game simply finds a method through which player aid can feel uninvasive, but retains it through this clever disguise nonetheless, so that it costs minimal effort to simply soak in and appreciate Sucker Punch Productions' creation. And while I wouldn't say the content found in this world is always tip-top notch and justifies this non-stop visual masterpiece, the open world's ability to convey atmosphere feels very much so like its own reward. But of course, that novelty does wear off, but fortunately Ghost of Tsushima has a system to reignite it. It's nothing major, but the 3-act story compartmentalizes the 3 regions. While it is all one open world, you're not gallivanting around the same areas for the entire game. We gain access to the 3 regions through the 3 acts, with the first region being in the far south, and then we unlock the second region with Act 2 and the third region with Act 3. And since the game isn't a year long, the regions you are running around don't get old before you leave them, so the novelty of having a new space to explore is restored as you progress. It's simple, and I'm well aware it's not unique to this game, but considering how much emphasis clearly went into ensuring you appreciate this world, I can't help but appreciate the straightforward things it does to accomplish it. And succeeding in rejuvenating the game on the fly doesn't always require a groundbreaking innovation. Sometimes the tried and trusted method simply works. A game doesn't always need to strive to be completely unique in every conceivable way, and God knows Ghost of Tsushima certainly isn't that, for it to come across as unique as a whole. So sometimes beautiful graphics, a fancy lick of paint over how the game delivers information to you, and a respect for the player's time conveniently come together to give you the feeling that spending time in this world was worthwhile. To compare it to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I'd argue that game's open world does in fact boast an appreciable aesthetic range to its regions. I've been replaying through that recently on and off, and where it doesn't capture the same wow factor as Ghost is the fact the novelty wears off too early because the game is like 60 hours long if you don't have time for bullshit. There's more than enough distinction between regions for this to not be the case, and while you could in theory haphazardly explore the entire map the moment you dropped in it, there is at the very least a vague level gating system that prevents you from doing so at least too successfully. But because you're spending too long in this game doing nondescript Viking things, places, not always, but often have a tendency to outstay their welcome, long before the narrative actually takes you somewhere new. There are only so many times you can get bored of where you are before you stop caring about where you end up next, because that repeatedly sets a precedent that no matter how aesthetically pleasant a region may be at first, you already know you'll grow tired of it long before you leave it, so when it comes to viewing it in hindsight you'll observe it as vague and purposeless. Ghost's world subsidizes a story that understands how much time it's worth, so the novelty of its fancy finish on a given playthrough is a lot harder to shake. That's not to say this game lacks for moments of vague purposelessness. After all, a lot of the side content I'd argue is Assassin's Creed side content level in quality, but a simple, universal respect for the player's time allows it to remain fresh for longer, and that's how you breed the greatest compliment a game can receive: the desire for more. Anyhow, it's time I move off of this point, because I don't believe Ghost has a flawless open world. I'll save talking side content until we get to its own segment, but a criticism I would level against the open world is, though it is visually gorgeous, I wouldn't necessarily skip to referring to it as lived in. Yes, it's plenty immersive, and there's adequate life filling this spectacular landscape. And of course there's a Mongol invasion that explains why there isn't too much human movement among docile NPCs, but there's no real spontaneous interaction in this game that runs particularly deep. If there is something to find, it typically constitutes grander side content. Random encounters while out and about are fairly basic, basically just finding Mongol patrols and people running afoul of Mongols, and there are rare occurrences where there is a tad more going on, but these moments are few and far between, and often they're outright hard to find and easy to miss. World engagement outside of defined content is rare. For the most part, the best you'll get is conversations with people where they might reveal a point of interest that typically falls under the umbrella of said defined content. Sometimes the conversations are just that, conversations, and they can be helpful in guiding you without you needing to resort to using the map. But the lineup of things that can happen outside of listed content is quite limited, and I'm not sure if it's more or less frustrating that there are a handful of instances where the game throws a genuine curveball at you. The best example I can give of this is finding a monk standing among bodies, surrounding a well from which we learn a mysterious plague has emerged. And while this event occurs at a reliable place, there's no marker guiding you here. This is not a side mission. Nonetheless, we can investigate if we want, and there is a payoff if we do, but the game doesn't guide us at all to it. We have to use the information the world provides because the map does not know. I have a soft spot for these in games because it's the world drawing you in to engage with it, and genuinely utilising the open world space created here to its full potential by having us take complete initiative on only a select few occasions. And I looked up the encounters that people have come across, and they typically tend to be lists detailing the same 5 or 6 things. However, I did find a pretty decent list on my last ill-advised trip to Reddit that suggests hidden in the game there's a greater number of these special encounters, and a lot of them seem to fall under the radar of not standing out too much from the more generic encounters that inhabit this world, and that likely doesn't help the ones that genuinely do seem quite unique because they're needles in a haystack. They're so easy to dismiss as something you can afford to miss, and it's the sea of interactions that instill this that allows for the layer that enables Ghost of Tsushima to feel alive, to easily fly under the radar. From a different perspective, this can be viewed as a good thing. If you set off to purely soak in and appreciate this world, and you spend enough time gallivanting around, Eventually, you'll happen upon 2, 3, maybe 10 of these. The reward of simply existing here goes far beyond the visual feast, but an element feels missing in the world delivery that allows you to, going in blind, unaided by guides on the internet, know that these moments are in here waiting for you. These unmarked interactions, moments of environmental storytelling are in there. There's plenty of stunning artistic scenery and points of interest to gaze upon. The environment feels alive and immersive, the weather potent, and the soundtrack fit for the ears of gods. Not that I'm religious, but allow me to hit the keyword so the Bible bashing bots show up. Anyway, where was I? This is certainly no dead open world, but I can't help but feel its wow factor is inhibited by a clear divide between content that either is or appears to be spontaneous, and interactions and content delivery that is so formulaic you can see how it's put together. And that's where I'm going to park the point, because I'm going to hope to make sense of it when we get to the side content segment. I promise it'll be worth it. Or am I lying? Find out. Nonetheless, the world remains a testament to solid art direction, and it's beyond apparent Sucker Punch Productions brought it alive through passion. It's truly fantastic to get lost in. The only thing I feel is missing, perhaps more so as a jaded Assassin's Creed fan above all else, is a city. But historically there wasn't one on Tsushima, so it's not like they could have just made one. Nonetheless, in the sequel I would certainly love to see denser urban environments. It's just the perfect foil to mile after mile of stunning scenery. But as to whether or not that's remotely feasible is not something I could comment on, so it's not really a critical point. But it's worth remembering Ghost is not an Assassin's Creed game, nor is it trying to cater to Assassin's Creed's niche. The fact that it circumstantially scratches some of the same itches does not mean it adheres to the same vision or lack thereof. So I try not to hold the itches it doesn't scratch against it, because while the similarities are extensive, it's not the same game. Now, if you're tired of hearing me talk about Ghost's environmental glory, let's talk some gameplay things. Navigation is bog standard, you can run around, you can ride horses, you can climb things, enjoy. But its most prominent action gameplay is divisible into two categories: combat and stealth. The combat system cannot be described as anything short of utterly fantastic. When I first played this game in 2020, I'm not gonna lie, I did find it a bit difficult to get my head around how it functioned, but once I overcame that hurdle I really understood and appreciated it. Naturally, being a samurai game, an entry requirement is that the combat has to be satisfying, it has to be smooth, it has to be reliable, and it has to give you a sense of, well, hell yeah. It can't be inconsistent, unsatisfying, superficial, or even remotely flirt with mediocrity. You can't give us samurai armor, a sexy sword, the perfect backdrop to enact this fantasy, and then drop us into a pit of sluggish combat. Unfortunately, Ghost doesn't. Even then, in many games a deep and rich combat system can be wasted on the player as they find what works for them, and then simply stick to it. What impresses me about Ghost of Tsushima in the combat respect is it's a balancing act between being complex enough that it doesn't come across as being superficial and boring after an hour, and yet also straightforward enough that there's no wasted complexity. This game delivers information and challenge to you in a way that encourages you to tap into your entire arsenal to overcome opponents. You have 4 different stances effective against different enemy archetypes that you can easily, rapidly switch between, and those are gradually unlocked as you go. So when it comes to deploying them in tandem, you're familiar with the bulk of your setup. The stone stance is most effective against swordsmen. This makes it the most balanced stance of the 4 and therefore the one that you utilise from the very beginning. The water stance is most effective against enemies with shields, and is characterised by heavy attacks intended to break down defences. The wind stance defends against spears and the like, with attacks intended to close the increased distance between yourself and your opponents, and the moon stance is effective against big men, otherwise known as brutes. These attacks are rapid, agile and disruptive. Its purpose is to slice through your opponent's brute force. It would be frustrating if these stances were singularly effective against their intended archetype, however, considering the game will throw waves at you and those waves might come with various archetypes within them. So while it might not be the most efficient method, yes, you can default to using a stance most effective against the opponents who are posing you the most threat at any given moment, and still effectively direct stray attacks to other enemies even if they don't belong to the particular archetype that your current used stance is most effective against. Nonetheless, the efficiency of using the correct stances against the correct enemies is seductive and satisfying enough to encourage you to inject that diversity into your playstyle. And this means the game's able to map 4 times as much depth to the controller without the inevitability of that becoming tedious, and also ensuring there's still integrity to the system and it doesn't default to becoming a hack and slash. At times, however, the controls for switching stances can be a bit sticky. But that's only if you've just already switched stances. You can't just rapidly change it out again. It doesn't seem to be a gameplay reason for this. I think it just boils down to the game getting a bit confused with what you're trying to accomplish. But as you waste less and less movement, this becomes much less of an issue. There is of course more to the combat than simply its stances. Beyond that, it's a dodge, parry, combo sort of setup, and the general clashing of metal that ensues is, as you can imagine, quite satisfying. For me, this is most appreciated during one-on-one duels. In these duels, you can't use your auxiliary tools, ranged weapons, bombs and the like, which are incredibly useful when facing waves upon waves of foes, and the whole purpose is simply to observe the elegance of the system. These fights ensure the fundamentals of the combat system don't get lost the more complex it gets, especially later on in the game. They also allow the art style of the world around us and the combat system to blend more intimately, and that makes them truly something to behold. A missed trick with these duels, however, has to occur in the multiplayer, Legends. It'd be cool to 1v1 duel other players, don't you think? Back to open combat, another layer are the tools, which can make short work of your opponents, and there are two elements at play: the damage you do, physically, and the fear you instill. If you're relentlessly savaging people, some enemies might run away or fall to the floor paralysed by fear, and you can execute them. And so the tools, special abilities, ranged weapons, even the stances, and the simple block, parry and combo system all come together as a challenge of efficiency and will reward you accordingly for being efficient. There's also a fifth stance of sorts, and I say of sorts because it's not really a stance, or at least it doesn't function the same way as the other four stances, and that is of course the ghost stance. After building up a kill chain without having taken damage, you'll get a prompt to press both joysticks in and enter the ghost stance. When you do, cinematic bars will creep in, the screen will go black and white, only flashing red as you deal unavoidable damage to your opponents, typically killing them outright. And while this is referred to as a stance, it's more akin to the other special abilities that allow you to do easy damage, albeit you're spending a built-up kill chain as opposed to your resolve. Altogether, this game's combat system comes together beautifully. It's well balanced and eases you into it, it's punishing when it has to be, but it's also forgiving. Its intricacy is explored over the course of the playthrough, and when you emerge as an unstoppable force of nature towards the back end of the game, you feel rewarded for engaging with it. Furthermore, the combat does not exist in a vacuum. Ghost of Tsushima utilises its art style to frequently convey a sense of mood in encounters. It prioritises being visceral, and also encourages player creativity. This is a combat system that enjoys itself just as much as the player enjoys it, and that beams through just how inspired it makes clear it is. It's satisfying on the controller, it's aesthetically pleasant, and it's consciously not an exercise in button mashing. It gets deeper both with how you progress through the narrative and as you pick up skill points. All things considered, it's a very rich experience. But no matter how complex it bids to get, I get the feeling nothing goes to waste, and that is what ultimately helps it thrive. As for the stealth, I have few complaints about that either. The environment's clearly designed to account for stealth with plenty of tall grass to hide in. We can even hide under and above buildings and simply sneak up on our enemies and assassinate them. And yes, it oddly uses the word assassinate for these prompts as opposed to stealth kill, which would be a more accurate description. But anyway, I digress. Stealth is intended to be an avenue of gameplay, but not necessarily the core gameplay. You have plentiful opportunities, plentiful skills, and plentiful tools to aid you should you take this route, and of course if you shit the bed in stealth, you can quickly and seamlessly use a stealth maneuver to enter combat. Now, it's really hard to find descriptive words that make the stealth seem grand in this game when it's overshadowed by the swordplay, and how much of Ghost of Tsushima's identity gets channeled through that by comparison to this, which is a rather bog-standard, albeit really good stealth setup. It works well, enemy detection isn't magical, and thus above all else it's viable. And as you go with the additions of poison darts and chain assassinations, it becomes expansive and fun to experiment with in its own right. But unlike the swordplay, here there's nothing distinctly attributable to Ghost of Tsushima necessarily. It's one of those systems that feels competent because it's done well, but is otherwise just a stealth system that for the most part you've seen before. But just because it's not as unique in feel as the combat doesn't make it any less fun. I think stealth can be tricky to make truly unique in an open world game setup, because through traditional methods there are only so many ways I suppose you can remain undetected, and that's to not be seen and sneak up on your enemies. Maybe you get some fancy tools that aid that, like smoke bombs, distractions, poison darts, but that's all very bog standard. But being unique is not what stealth necessarily needs. It needs to be fun, satisfying on the controller, and aesthetically pleasant doesn't hurt either. In those respects, Ghost of Tsushima's stealth is hard to dismiss. It works beautifully, and that's more than I can say for a lot of games that boast stealth mechanics. And what I mean by that is this game could afford to push us into stealth more often than it actually does. In fact, stealth being mandatory only occurs in a few missions, at least to the extent where you can't be detected for very long periods. They could certainly have got away with more. I'm glad that they didn't necessarily, because I like having the choice, but the fact that it works so well, and more often than not it is an option, encourages you to play around with it. Not necessarily in an absolute format either, sometimes just to see how it functions in tandem with the combat system. And that's where its unique value comes out, how well it integrates with other mechanics in this game. And if nothing else, Ghost plays fluid. There are some points where the stealth does get a bit dry. For instance, there are tailing missions, and following people while remaining undetected, if it's overused, can be quite irritating. But being a self-described jaded Assassin's Creed fan, I find them oddly comforting now. And perhaps another minor bone I'd pick, well, it's cartilage really, is the fact that we can't move and hide bodies. There are minor limitations to how we can engineer a situation, and slapping a body in the patrol path of another guard might very well be one way in which you can manoeuvre such a situation. And it would be nice to see stealth in the sequel encompass this, because it would be another limitation removed on how we can use stealth to manipulate our foes to go where we want them, or behave how we want them to. Another area I've seen people talk about is enemy AI detection can sometimes be a bit hit and miss, and I suppose I can see that. It doesn't really work against you, but it would be more interesting for Ghost of Yotei to refine and implement more layers of detection, and how guards behave when they suspect you're nearby that might add an interesting dynamic to the mix. But I can't say this was a flaw I necessarily suffered too extensively. Now, people like to liken the stealth in this game to that scene in the Assassin's Creed series. Now, I do have to question if those people have eyes, because this game's stealth is not social stealth, it's traditional stealth. And I always found the Assassin's Creed games that featured the more traditional stealth more heavily than social stealth, if social stealth was even present at all, it felt like a bit of an afterthought. Here it doesn't. You can rely upon the stealth system in Ghost of Tsushima. It's not a case where combat is an inevitability. That's up to you. But yes, much like Assassin's Creed at its best, these systems work best when they aren't functioning in a vacuum. I found myself enjoying the flow of clearing out camps by thinning the ranks before revealing myself and then taking on the remainder in combat. And that entire dynamic develops as an interaction with the story. You see, the gameplay is Jin's tactics evolving. He's becoming less samurai and more the Ghost, still retaining his crucial training, but ultimately much more effective through his adaptability. Throughout the story, we keep hearing about how dishonourable the Ghost's deeds are, at least in the eyes of Lord Shimura, and by extension Jin's own upbringing, but it's here that we get to observe that, and ultimately we get the final say on just how far Jin is willing to go to save Tsushima. And while there's no player decision as such that necessarily influences the story beats, there are some differences made in the world depending on how you play the game. If you fully embrace the Ghost route, the weather becomes rainier, stormier, more narratively appropriate. And if you play more honourably, the weather is much more mild. And it reflects the headspace that you, the player, occupy based on the information provided to you and how you interpret Jin's character and gameplay. Of course, most players won't be thinking about it, it's entirely subconscious, and most players, like myself, probably will succumb to the seductive nature of just how much easier playing as the Ghost makes the game. But it is weird that this game's background honour system boils down to this negligible system that requires hours upon hours of experimentation to even recognise. Either way, to an extent, you have to engage with stealth, you have to commit dishonourable deeds, you have to watch this woman spinning for no discernible reason, and thus the choices that dictate this subtle difference is subtler still. Because the story's on rails, it funnels you into moments that justify Jin becoming the Ghost. All you get a say in is how much he becomes engrossed in that persona. Does he resort to underhanded but pragmatic tactics when it's convenient, or when he just has no choice? In the end of the day, it's an artistic thing of no bearing. But Sucker Punch Productions clearly flirted with the idea of how you approach the gameplay having an impact, and that's only realised to a very muted capacity. And the only time where that becomes a problem is if you attempt to face your enemies head on all the time. Because then your thought process becomes, this is contradicting the story beats, especially later on in the game. But I don't actually think it is. I think the way the samurai code of honour is portrayed in Ghost of Tsushima is a lot less flexible than people realise. Yes, we can fight the Mongols head on, but with an arsenal of non-standard tools, and new stances that we unlock as we go. The combat at the very start of the game, when Jin is entirely a samurai, doesn't encompass much of what is just combat stuff. And so, we can only conclude the ghost element is not a simple coin toss between stealth and loud and proud combat. If it were that simple, why wouldn't Jin start the game with all 4 stances available? I mean, he'd be trained to use them, wouldn't he? The never-ending cesspit of game logic bullshit aside, the evolution of Jin's tactics are integral to the storytelling. It affects how he deploys the open combat just as much as him utilising stealth at all. Jin isn't just learning to use stealth in tandem with his already finely tuned combat prowess. That aspect to his tactical arsenal is evolving as well. If you observe how limited the combat is at the start of the game versus how expansive it is come the end, at least by comparison you'll come to the conclusion the gameplay has, in a way, transformed. And that occurs because of its journey too. So unless you consciously limit yourself to stone stance, beginning every encounter with standoffs, and a diet of pure maniacal grit, firstly, allow me to applaud your stubbornness. Second, Jin becomes the ghost in gameplay whether you like it or not. But considering the game forces you into dishonourable segments, I think it's fair to say, all in all, this is not a dilemma the game necessarily wants you to consider as the player. Just experience, playing out, and the minor weather changes depending on how much you become engrossed in it is just there for the stubborn to notice more than people who are casually playing the game. For them it's just an art direction. And as Google has just told me, you can calm the weather with your flute. I never really paid attention to that. But I couldn't honestly tell you if I wanted to live Jin's dilemma more in the gameplay, with more passing opportunities to do the honourable thing, and moments where I'm more consciously engaging in the ghost gameplay, and then going to experience whether or not that affects narrative beats. The premise of the game was never really established as player choice, so while I can personally understand where some fringe complaints regarding this are coming from, I don't typically find myself disappointed by those things. But in some respects, yes, it would have been nice to grapple with this dilemma alongside Jin rather than just observe him go through it, but that wasn't necessarily a missed opportunity, rather merely a constraint, and telling a refined story has to take priority over telling several variants of the same story, depending on player action. This is not an RPG. Another thing I've seen spoken about is because of how the gameplay interacts with the storytelling, you're constantly unlocking new things, and as a result you only truly get the ghost gameplay unleashed come Act 3. And that's a point I certainly can appreciate where it's coming from. But I also disagree. I quite appreciate how the storytelling complements the ever-expanding gameplay. This is a journey for Jin, and as his character changes, the gameplay evolves with it. And come the back end of the game, no longer is he bound by a philosophy the game portrays as flawed for the status quo rather than the people, a philosophy the Khan exploits. The gameplay illustrates the ghost freeing himself of his limitations, and that too is a key aspect to the story. And so, through this long-winded approach, the gameplay remains linked to the narrative rather than existing alongside it, and that gives the entire process a sense of purpose. Now, I'd like to move off of that point and talk upgrades and things. I've already briefly addressed the element of skill points. Basically, as you increase your legend, you unlock skill points at key points. It's a leveling system, but it's a bit more disguised, and with these skill points, named technique points, you invest them in skills. Congratulations, welcome to the club of playing the exact same as every other game ever. But unlike the cluttered, convoluted skill trees of, say, Assassin's Creed, where there are so many perks to unlock that most of them are just copied and pasted about 20 times each, every technique point you invest in Ghost feels well spent. Like I said, one of Ghost's gameplay's greatest advantages is how it fosters a natural inclination to utilise all of it. So yes, there are various rudimentary skill trees, but none of them are particularly overwhelming to observe, and it's not that hard to prioritise what you want to unlock first, and as a result you spend less time looking at a monotonous menu and more time playing the actual game. without having to implement a cop-out to circumnavigate the player having to engage with the system at all. After all, you want the player to engage with this stuff, otherwise why give them the choice in the first place? With regards to this, what Ghost understands is simple works best because it's much less of a pain. And yes, there are games out there with fantastically elaborate skill investment systems, but Ghost of Tsushima is not a gigantic game, and therefore its systems are appropriate for what it is. And since the game isn't pretending to be grander, simple does indeed work best. It has more layers with upgrades to weapons and armor, charms and so on, but if you really wanted me to get into the gritty of that, I'd get bored, never mind you. I like that these systems overall feel purposeful and work, okay? So, let's move on fully to the mixed bag. Ghost of Tsushima's side content. To me, this is where the criticisms likening Ghost of Tsushima to Ubisoft open world games in general holds the most water, but it isn't entirely soulless, or even close. We've already gone over how beautiful and stylish the world is, and the hidden encounters that make it feel alive, if you go out your way to find them. But the side stuff beyond this is a genuinely strange mixture. You have some high quality side missions, such as mythic tales made iconic by these blue icons. You get these cool, artistic cutscenes that draw you into the unique story being told, and then you're sent off to investigate them for a variety of reasons. They typically end up in a duel, and should you emerge victorious, you come away with a unique piece of gear, or unlock a special ability that can only be acquired through doing this mythic tale. This malarkey combined with the story being told, and the story you are then following in the footsteps of, make them perhaps some of the most interesting side bits Ghost of Tsushima has to offer. They follow the game's ethos of being artistically inspired, and they culminate in the very best, most satisfying gameplay. Beyond this, there are of course other side missions, though they do tend to fall into a pit of being generic, telling stories that aren't all that interesting but justify continuing moving forwards. And these are the nothing special side missions that feel easy to mass produce. But the side missions I really like, the ones that flesh out the story a bit, are the ones that pertain to side characters, your allies. You help them with their struggles over the course of the 3 acts, and it feels like it would make sense as to why they would follow you into the pits of hell. And this gives meat to the main story, because there's a story purpose for why you engage with this content as you find it, and Ghost's main storyline isn't really the longest without them. Like your other side missions, they're still a mixed bag of tame and interesting, but there are at the very least some really good character moments in there. I think aiding Lady Masako in her mission for vengeance are probably my favourite ones, but they aren't all that different from the ones for Sensei Ishikawa, Norio, Yuna. Kenji's just there for comic relief really, we'll ignore him. And these overarching subplots typically hinge on an investigation. And to me, that's never not an interesting hook. I love nothing more than getting to the bottom of a good mystery, especially the ones that pertain to the world that we find ourselves in. And since these characters are portrayed as believable inhabitants of this world, it does ultimately come together. But when you look past the concept of side missions, Ghost of Tsushima rapidly descends into a world of checklisty objectives, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We do of course have to liberate the island, which means going to various locations and clearing out the Mongols. It's not the most riveting of things, but the gameplay systems make it fun. While nothing here requires too much thought, there is an odd satisfaction to simply enjoying good gameplay and having the game justify you use it for no particular reason, because the open world says so, and have it feel as if you're working towards something in the process. So, in that respect, yes, it's a bit Ubisofty, but no, it's not necessarily bad. If the game was 10 times larger and had 10 times more of this, I'd probably start to see the negative in it. At least more than I already do. But if the actual gameplay loop that you're engaging in a rudimentary fashion is satisfying to utilise, it's a lot less of a problem over the course of a game that doesn't outstay its welcome. But while you might enjoy it, you're not necessarily going to remember it, because it's very basic in substance and no amount of hidden written lore that you can find at these camps is necessarily going to change that. Because in essence, no matter how good the game is, it's still, to an extent, filler. And yes, it's reasonable to expect a portion of this in almost any open world game. But the reason why you find yourself liberating Tsushima through these camps over and over again is because of a simple age-old reason in any game it crops up in. The game simply runs out of stories to tell you long before the open world runs out of space. And this isn't necessarily a dig at Ghost. It's more my observation that it's virtually, if not outright impossible to make a perfect open world because naturally you need a bit of filler to fill it. And there's not a single open world game on the market that hasn't had content that I didn't enjoy engaging with anywhere near as much as the rest of it. And that's my idea of being fair here. Checklisty content is never anything special, but sometimes it does have necessity. Games aren't developed in a pocket dimension where time doesn't exist, and aren't subject to an infinite supply of cash. Unless you're one of the select few, compromise is inevitable. It's just more noticeable in some games than others. Unfortunately for Ghost of Tsushima, when that crops up, the gameplay does pick up the slack, and that if anything fashions the use of the space for this more checklisty content into a bit of a positive, because you want to go and test out your skills somewhere where you don't necessarily need to follow a narrative path of any variety. Ultimately, locations you need to simply clear out boil down to how you view them. Yes, they fill the space, but what realistically would fill the space if they weren't there? Furthermore, can the gameplay stand on its own 2 feet through these bits? And if the answer is yes, it's not an ungodly sin to use a bit of filler. They may not be the best, most memorable parts of the game, but they do allow you to linger in it. Viewpoints, however, can get thoroughly Jokes aside, they're fine, they're just nothing special, and more than anything it's these bad boys that justify incessant comparisons to Assassin's Creed. But as we're about to go into, just because the side content at times feels like a massive checklist doesn't mean it's all generic. You see, Ghost of Tsushima can be uniquely engaging just as much as it can be uniquely bland. There may not be a sweeping sense of occasion to everything we do in this game, but thought has clearly gone in to ensure that everything fits. Lighthouses may indeed be akin to Assassin's Creed's traditional viewpoints, but they're fine. Random duels with Ronin out in the sticks? Give it to me. I don't even care that they have the loosest story reasons for existing known to man. The duels in this game simply never get old. They're so thrilling that I don't care for the story reasoning, I just want to engage with them. Not that story reasoning goes amiss wherever it crops up, but just being able to pull up to one of these intense fights is good enough for me sometimes, and the side content certainly facilitates that. And then you have the bamboo strikes. Other than being a dyspraxic's nightmare, they're a chill way to get used to this game's finer controls. They also have a tangible gameplay effect as they increase Jin's resolve. And so despite being a bit fiddly at first, you persevere, and nothing is ever that fiddly again. Taking dips in hot springs gradually increase Jin's maximum health, and we get to observe his cheeks. But they're more than just an exercise in observing the man's poo shaft. This side content further justifies itself as Jin can reflect on aspects of his life, providing added depth to his stoic, introspective character. You can follow foxes to Inari shrines and acquire charms, and of course you can then in turn pet the foxes, something you may or may not wish to continue doing when you find out what noise they make. Find vanity gear at Pillars of Honor that comes with its own little perks. And you find yourself subconsciously deciding to do all of this because the game naturally guides you to these locations. You can compose haikus with a surprising variety of options. Much like the hot springs, they present a reflective side to Jin, while also injecting an air of player creativity. The game encourages the player to use these to relax and take in the environment.
Whispers through the trees, swaying freely in the wind, growing ever strong. The old man was right. My spirit feels at peace, strong.
And for it you get a series of headbands named for the concept that you reflect on. So yes, Ghost of Tsushima's side content does get repetitive. It may indeed start feeling like a checklist, and some things are higher quality than others, but throughout it all, the game still feels like it has a soul. And that is what ultimately separates it from your average Ubisoft open world format. Sure, it perhaps gets a bit too comfortable in what it does offer, but I couldn't tell you there's a moment where Sucker Punch Productions' passion slipped. The content exists so you can take in the beauty of the game. It doesn't always offer the most spontaneous of content, but almost everything still feels rather purposeful. It doesn't immunize everything from being farcical at times, but it has too much going for it for you to simply engage with this game for the sake of it. Its intent is to naturally draw you in, have you complete tasks before you realise you're doing them. It falls back on reasoning that extends far beyond simply being a game and that's what you do in games to justify you going out and seeking out this side content, however deep it may or may not be. And goes to show that you can get away with an awful lot of filler, provided the game has a soul. Would I like Ghost of Yotei to refine this, to improve upon the side content by giving us more meaning to things at times? Absolutely. But for a first run out, Ghost of Tsushima hit the spot quite nicely. It does enough to make its inconsistencies forgivable, and while there's always room for improvement and what is objectively not filler will always trump what is, Ghost of Tsushima still remains a game I couldn't imagine rushing through and not taking my time to enjoy. If anything, it could do with a greater array of inspiration in its side missions, however consequential they happen to be, as yes, they often fall into a predictable layout. And yes, it would be nice to have more avenues of unpredictability in this world. I'd like to see it come full circle more in a way that the Mongol invasion probably wasn't the setting to do it in. I'd love to see a world like this, made by Sucker Punch Productions in situ, and that is what Ghost of Yotei hopefully will deliver. And so, as we come to today's video's conclusion, I want to say this. If Ghost of Yotei comes out and it's exactly the same as Ghost of Tsushima, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Sure, there need to be slight adjustments to the gameplay, the side content, and overall how the world stitches itself together, and it wouldn't go amiss for those to be there, but ultimately Ghost of Tsushima is still a fantastic game. It's been a genuine treat to replay, just as it was a genuine treat to play for the first time almost 5 years ago. As for comparisons between it and Assassin's Creed, at a surface level, I can see where they're coming from, but underneath you understand the key difference between how Sucker Punch has made this game and how Ubisoft made those games. The genuine universal care that went into it that came from most, if not all, facets of its production. But before you get it twisted, Ghost is not even close to an Assassin's Creed clone. Nonetheless, it scratches many of the same itches that Ubisoft's flagship franchise once did, and I have no clue how intentional that was, but in doing this, Sucker Punch Productions still struck out and made their own thing here. But when people like myself compare Ghost to Assassin's Creed, we mean it entirely as a compliment, because through that lens it was a dream game when it dropped in the turbulent year of 2020, and regardless of how it goes, I'm 100% on board to see what comes next. Thank you for watching me ramble my balls off. I'll see you soon.